So here we go. So we're going to be doing an introduction to Angular.js. Before we get into that, who am I? I will give a slightly more exhaustive bio. Basically, I run a consulting company, which is just me. I've done that for about 15 years now. And I am basically one of the world's leading experts in Flash and in action-driven programming. I'll answer a lot of questions on Stack Overflow. I'm a member of the Apache Flex team, which when Adobe dumped Flex, they went to Apache. So done a lot of stuff. But of course, Flash and Flex are not nearly as relevant as they once were for various reasons we will not get into now. So I actually created a course to teach Flex developers about Angular.js. So if anybody's interested in that, I'm told the Angular.js piece will work standalone, even if you don't know anything about Flex. So there's over 6 hours of video and screencasts up there. So if anybody's interested, it's lifeafterflex.com. My own little inside joke. Angular.js, what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what Angular.js is and why we might care about it. Then we're going to talk about some of the basics you need to know about creating Angular.js applications, modules and controllers, how they work together, the scope service and how that is used. And then we'll talk about creating your own service, which is, we'll get into that as we go. And if anybody has any questions, just raise your hand or scream them out or whatnot. So what is Angular.js? Angular.js is really a JavaScript framework. It extends the HTML DOM by adding new attributes, and everything handles it under the hood, so we do within the framework, so we don't have to do it. The main purpose of Angular.js is really a JavaScript framework for programmers and designed to make things easily testable. And so we can build things in nice, discrete chunks of code that we can then easily test. Programmers like tests, especially if you're dealing with something important like payment systems. Then you can make changes and run the tests without having fear of killing production. In the real world, I've noticed not a lot of people actually use tests, other than theoretically. But if you're doing anything that touches money, I strongly recommend considering code that can be testable and then writing tests against it. But, oh yeah, I have dependency injection up there, which, does anybody know what dependency injection is? All right, somebody tell me then.
It's a way of making your code less dependent on other parts of the code.
Yep. Yeah, basically the way I would describe it is you basically create a single object, usually a single object, that hangs out in memory somewhere, and then you sort of the framework handles sending it to methods or, in case of Angular.js, controllers as needed. But it's a programming design pattern, which we don't need to go into too many details, but you will see it in use today as we get into code examples. So you want to use Angular. The first thing you have to do is load the Angular library. In HTML, we do that with the script tag. And now I have it locally. I did that just for the samples, so I had no idea what type of internet connection I had. And I'm also using an old version of Angular for these samples. But there's new versions of Angular, more up to date. And normally you wouldn't load the Angular library locally. You would use it off the Google CDN, which so ideally other people have it cached, and that makes your upload quicker. So the first thing we need to do when creating an Angular.js module, or an Angular.js application, is create the module. And a module basically defines certain aspects of the Angular application. And we attach it to some element of the DOM, usually the body tag or the HTML tag, but it could be a div. You can actually have different Angular applications sitting side by side within the same HTML page. And I think I have a sample for that. I'll look at the script tag first, so I'll work from the bottom up. So the script tag is just JavaScript code. And we create a JavaScript variable called hello world. Hello world is a common programmer idiom for examples. And we call Angular, which is an object created by the Angular framework. So basically is the Angular framework. And then we're calling the module function on top of that Angular framework. And we're giving the module a name, hello world, and we're sending it a list of options, or an array of options. In this case, we have an array of empty options. And it's not something I'll go into as part of this presentation. And then on the body tag, you see I have the ng app directive. That basically tells the Angular framework that there's an Angular application here on the body tag. So go find this hello world variable, and that'll point to the Angular application. And so now, with this code, we've set up an Angular application in this page on the body tag. It doesn't do anything yet, but it's there. So to do something, we need a controller. And the place for a controller is basically a collection of JavaScript code. And it's the business logic of your app. So Angular is often for a clear separation for your JavaScript code and your Vue code. Or the Vue code usually will be HTML-based code. So that's what a controller is. And this is how we create one. So I'll work from the bottom up again. So hello world, we're basically calling, we have our module, our hello world application, and we're calling the controller function on that, which is part of this the Angular framework. And we're giving it a name, which is HW controller for this case, so hello world controller. And then we have an array, and the array has two options. The first is its scope. This is a specific Angular service, which we'll cover in a second. And the function is actually the controller code. So you put all your controller code inside this function. And then I put a div inside the body and use the ng controller directive, which is an Angular specific directive, and it points to that HW controller. So is everybody with me, or am I going too quick? No. So the scope service. This is something we passed into the controller when we were creating it. So the scope service is used for sharing functions and variables between the Vue code and the controller code. You just sort of access it as any argument to a function when you're in the controller. And in the Vue, you actually have this special curly bracket syntax to access elements in the scope. There's another way to view things or use things in the Vue. If you're doing an attribute, a special Angular attribute, it can have access to values in the scope, and you don't need the curly brackets in that case. But we'll get into that, or show an example of that in a bit. So this is really simple code. Once again, working from the bottom up, and you can see sort of with each aspect of the app, the code is growing. So we're creating a single variable within the scope object, and it has the value of hello. And then up at the top, inside the div, which has the controller, we have we're basically outputting using this double curly bracket syntax. So this is basically all the code I just showed you. I'll go through it again. So import the script tag, or use the Angular library. Then we create the Angular application and save it in this JavaScript variable called hello world. Then off that variable, we create a controller named HW controller. And we're going to pass this special Angular thing named scope into our controller function. And this Angular service, we have the hello variable, which we create on it with the value of hello. Then up top, the body tag, we define the ng app and point it to that hello world application. Then we have the ng controller with a div inside the body tag. So the controller and the app are associated. And then finally, we output this variable we created using this strange double curly bracket syntax. So Angular is going to process the page, create the app, and create the controller. Then parse the DOM. It's going to say, here's the app. The controller controls this. Oh, here's this double curly bracket syntax. So let me go look into the controller's scope for the value of this variable, and it's going to output it. So, and as boring as it is, this is all the code. So it's very complicated just to print hello on the screen. But it can get much more complex than that. So anybody have any questions?
So it's hard to read everything you put on one page. So how do you separate them?
There are ways. Which actually I left out of this presentation, but we can talk a little about that. So basically, just like the Angular library is a script, so we could also move this script into a separate JS file and then import it using a script tag the same way. So that'll give us separation between our app and our controller, and we can even create multiple files. So I'll often create one file for the app, so basically to create the initial module, and then another for each controller, because often you have more than one controller inside an app. And then if you're doing any sort of services, or which is not something I've really discussed before yet, creating your own services, those can go in separate files also. And so, and with a view, if you want to separate view code, you would use, let's see if I have, there. You would usually do ng-include. So you would usually use a div and then use this ng-include directive to put your HTML code in elsewhere. But so that's basically how. Does that answer the question?
Okay.
Yeah, it's yeah. Anybody else? Go ahead.
Kind of a silly question, but approximately how big is the Angular library?
That's a really good question. Off the top of my head, I have no idea.
Okay. Is it large or small?
The minimized version, probably medium. So I guess, let's just look it up. And there, 103K.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So not small, but not large, or not overly large. But often when you start getting real apps together, you're often piecing a lot of different things together. So you often load the whole jQuery framework and and such. So I mean, it can balloon quickly,
exactly.
the size of your libraries, and that's often why you want to reference that Google CDN, so you don't have to reload it, because ideally your users are already going to have it cached from there, ideally.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
That might wait a while, but can you customize the controller to be like responsive ready? Like, like responsive program idioms where they just sort of jQuery size to the tablet.
Well, that would be a view thing, so it wouldn't be in the controller.
Okay.
But I mean, yes. With the controller, it's just a div, so you can use any sort of CSS you want.
Okay.
And technically, you could write code if you wanted. So we could. So there's like an ng style directive, so we can change the style on a directive inside a controller, for example. And actually, at the end, I'll show an example of an app I built, so which uses some of that sort of stuff. Yeah, so unless anybody stops me, I'm going to go back to.
What are all the, like the looks like it looks like an ID, right? For the ng, where all the syntax comes from. Like I see it even give you.
Oh, I'm just using IntelliJ, and they have a plugin for Angular, so that's probably why.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, so that's why I have code hinting and all that stuff.
And how do you do that? What is probably used? What is this that you use?
This is IntelliJ.
IntelliJ?
Yeah, so it's an IDE from JetBrains. It's basically can handle just about any programming language. I was talking with some people earlier. They're using PHP Storm, I think, which is just sort of a customized version of IntelliJ. Whereas IntelliJ does everything. But then the JetBrains also offers basically limited versions.
IntelliJ.
Yep. Yeah, no. It's very well liked by most programmers. So, let's talk about collecting input from users, because most applications you build will have to do something more than display hello to the screen, I assume. So for that, we're going to use something, another Angular directive, which is called the ng-model directive. And this is going to be used as a tribute. It can be used on a lot of the HTML components. I'm going to use it in text input for the purposes of demonstration. So we just take the ng-model and specify a variable which will be located in the scope. And then as we change, if we change the variable within the scope, it'll also change the display. So in this case, the value displayed inside the text input. If we type in the text input, it will also change the value inside the scope, which will be accessible inside the controller. So I mean, the two things use this binding to communicate together. And I'm going to, very simple change here. So I'm just taking the app we previously had, and I'm just adding that input, the text input, and ng-model equals hello. So it's going to, when we type in this input, it's going to change the scope variable hello, which will in turn change the output variable displayed. So we type here, it's going to change it in the controller, and it's going to change it in the display. And that is sample 2. And there's really nothing new to the code that I didn't just show you on the slides. So hello, Danbury.io. Yeah, so it's just a cool little thing with binding and how it works. And these are simple things, but can be combined together to build much more impressive things. So, there we go. Any questions? Everybody still with me? Good. So, we spoke about variables in the scope and basically sharing data, but you can also have functionality in the scope. So from your view, you can call a method inside the controller. And there's a bunch of different directives that'll allow you to do this. I'm going to look at ng-click, which basically a button click. So you click on the button, it calls a method, and that something happens. So once again, I'll go from the top down. So I created a function called reset, which is saved into the scope as reset. And it just puts the hello variable back to the text hello. And then we have the button up top, ng-click, and it calls the reset function. Angular does magic, it automatically knows the resets in the scope, and it calls it, and it should all work. Let's find out. So, hello world, blah, blah, blah. And then I click the reset, which is going to trigger off the function inside the scope, which is going to change the variable, the scope variable, which will then update the display. And one thing you'll notice, when we hit reset, it's updating this hello variable everywhere. So it updated both our input and our output. So like every time you use this variable, it's linked together and they're always the same. So everybody with me? Should I keep going? Okay, let's talk about services a bit. Now, we've been using one service. I'm talking about services here, I'm talking about services within the Angular. I'm not talking about like REST or remote services that would be on the server side. So Angular calls them services, sometimes factories, sometimes providers. They're all slightly different within the Angular context, but they're all basically the same thing in terms of practical use. So we've been using one service, which is an Angular-specific service, the scope service, and that service is used to share data and functions between the controller and the view. But we can make our own service, which is basically just JavaScript code, so not dissimilar to the controller. So our own services can also have data and functionality. I actually often use services if I want to encapsulate out functionality that will call a server. In this case, we're going to do something similar but simpler. We're basically going to take the app we just built and rework it so that we have two controllers. The variable hello is shared between the two controllers inside its own service, and then one controller view will have the update, so the text input, and the other controller view will have the display or the output. I have singleton up here. Who knows what a singleton is? Go for it. Actually, you answered last time.
Yeah, somebody else.
There's only one instance of the object in the whole context, usually request code.
That is correct, yes. So a singleton is an object where there's only one instance of it in the whole application, and every time you reference that object, you always get the same instance. So, and that is basically what a service is and how we're going to use it, because we want to share data. So how do we create a service in Angular.js? Well, once again, we're going to reference that module, that Angular.js module, and we're going to call the service function on it. And we're going to give it a name, and that name is what we will use to reference it. And we will, and then a function, which is all the code that makes up the service. So the first time we call this, or use this service, Angular.js is going to call the function and save the resulting object. And then every future reference to that service will just get the object, instead of having to call the function again. So this is a whole lot of code. Yep, so this creates two controllers. C1 and C2 is what I called them for the purposes of the sample. And now, previously when we created a controller, we had the scope, and then we had the function. In this case, we added another one, shared model, which references back to our service, which we create up here, which is named shared model. So this this array, refers to Angular.js dependency injection syntax. So it's scope shared model is going to be passed into scope and shared model. And there's various reasons for that, which relate to code minimizers, why you want to put these in strings, but those not. But that's beyond the scope, or was intended to be beyond the scope of this presentation, so I'm digressing a bit. So, yep, and at the very top, I'm creating an app called sharing, and then I'm creating the service on that app, and then the controllers. So there's the HTML piece. So the ng app I put on the body with the name sharing, which I'll switch back and forth. Actually, let's just go into actual code here. Angle 4. So we import the Angular library. We create a sharing module. Then we create a service on that module named shared model. And there is one value in here, my value, which is my shared value. And we create a controller 1, which has scope. And so scope is the Angular service, which we don't have to manually define. And shared model is our own custom service, which we had created. And it passes in. And we add a reference to the shared model within the scope, so that it's accessible in the view. And in controller 2, we're doing, in essence, the same thing. But actually, the two controllers are almost identical. Normally they wouldn't be, but in this case they are. So in controller 1, we have our text input, which references my shared model.value. So it's referencing the service, which is in the scope, and then the value inside that service. And it allows for changes in controller 1. And in controller 2, we're doing the same thing just to output that data. So when we run this, it's actually going to look identical to sample 3. It's just a whole different implementation. Hello world again. So these things are tied together, even though now we have a more complicated app across controllers. And like I said, I'm taking very simple samples for the purpose of this.
So what was the reason to go with the more complex approach? Just for the sake of displaying the options?
Yeah, exactly. In this case, it's just to sort of give options and show how Angular can be separated. Like I said, actually, I think I'm going into a real app. So, yeah. So, this is an app. This is actually the app I built in my tutorial series. So this is all HTML and Angular. This is a login view. So let's see. We log in, and I just created 2 buttons to easy login. It loads up data into data grid. This is a simple task manager application because that's always what programmers use when they want to demonstrate something. So I'm using a bunch of different controllers here. So for the filters, I have a bunch of different. So like the filters up here do a controller. So I just can show all completed tasks or all open tasks, and do categories, etc., etc. There's its own controller for creating a new task. New task from Danbury.io meetup. Save, etc., etc. We can edit a task like that. There it is. Edited. So there's like so the pop-up for creating a new task or editing a task has its own controller. The screen for displaying the grid has its own controller. If we actually want to schedule tasks for a certain day, I clicked the button. Somebody was asking about styles and changing and making everything fit. I basically changed the screen layout when I clicked this button using that ng style tag. And I'm going to, and you'll notice we got a plus button which showed up once we expanded. So I'm going to add and then I'm going to save. But this is the actual app I go through in the course series I had put together. So does that sort of answer the question about controllers and why you would have more than one? Yes, maybe. It's just a lot of separation of responsibilities is what it comes down to. So yeah, and I think I'm out of slides now. So yeah, what we covered, we spoke about what Angular.js is and why we might care. We spoke about modules, Angular.js app and controllers and how they work together. We spoke about the scope service, how we can use it to collect input and to run events, or use Angular events to run methods and variable binding. And then I showed you how to create your own service. And yeah, there's the discount code again, if anybody wants the course. And questions?
Yes.
Yeah, well,
Sorry.
I think we need a minute to absorb and formulate.
Yeah.
It's fairly simple, but then
It
right,
can be fairly simple. It can get very complex.
as usual. Right?
Yes, as
It
usual.
depends what side you're looking at it.
Yep. Yeah, and I guess I'll say about this app. I was speaking to some people earlier about Bootstrap UI and how it's primarily CSS framework. This is actually using under the hood. It's called UI Bootstrap, which is an Angular wrapper for the Bootstrap library. So these date pop-ups, these are Bootstrap date choosers.
Looking nice and
Yeah. Yep. And the way I created this pop-up is also using that Bootstrap library.
So if I develop Bootstrap site, I can obviously combine the two, right?
Yeah.
You just use the Angular.
Yes. Yeah, I just use the Angular because it's a little easier to get the two to work together. But you don't need to.
So this looks like a bunch of data. Where's the data sitting?
This data is stored in a SQL Server database on a server somewhere.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So so within the training course, I actually wrote 2 books, one on Node.js and one on Cold Fusion, to explain how to get the data. so like I did a very clear separation in the books. So the main book uses mock services and doesn't deal with the backend at all. But yeah, but there is a live backend. The app does work, and this app is live. Yeah, so this is using the Cold Fusion services.
But you could also just have a flat file.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. As long as you had some code to access it. Yes.
I did some dabbling a few years ago with Cake PHP, which is an MVC PHP framework.
Yep.
And I guess from what I recollect, like the controller will get a URL. You'll do like a mapping. You'll map it to certain classes and methods, and then that it crunches out your logic. It'll go to your model, your database, and then it'll supply these tokens, and it'll generate the view. I guess my question to you is, can you map certain controllers to certain URL spaces? Can you, as a developer, envision?
Yes, and actually, let's reload. Yeah. You'll notice I actually have that. So this is the login screen, basically, and it has login in the URL up there. But once I actually get in, it changed. So really, there's 2 views, and those both relate to the URL. There's the login view and the task view for this app. Yeah, but it could get more complex depending what you need to do. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Would you be open to taking a short break and then doing some more Q&A, or maybe
Sure.
some example questions?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm fine with whatever.
Great. So let's
Thank
take a little break. Thanks, Jeff.